This is part 2 of our discussion of the magisterium of Pope Pius XII as pertains to cinema. In part 1, we discussed the first part of his apostolic exhortation on the ideal film. We're going to finish that today and also touch on his encyclical Miranda Prorsus on film, radio, and television. So let's jump right into it. Let's go to part 2. This was his audience in October 1955. We're not going to dwell on this probably as at great length as the first part, but basically he's continuing. Earlier he had said that the ideal film can be viewed in relation to the subject, that is the spectator, in relation to the object, that is the content of the film, and in relation to the community. And in part 1 he dealt with the spectator, and in this second audience he dealt with the content of the film and the community. So, the ideal film considered in relation to the object or to its content. Here we get into the transcendentals. All right. So, quoting Pius XII here, insofar as the film has reference to man, it will be ideal in content to the extent that, in perfect and harmonious form, it measures up to the original and essential demands of man himself. Basically, these demands are 3: truth, goodness, beauty, refractions, as it were, across the prism of consciousness of the boundless realm of being, which extends beyond man, in whom they actuate an ever more extensive participation in being itself. He's talking about, morality a lot and psychology in the first part, but here he gets more universal: truth, goodness, and beauty, and that these, when these refract across the prism of consciousness, they actuate in man an ever more extensive participation in being itself, which is a big claim. And he goes on to say, quote, "It is true that in individual cases, he who devotes himself through art and culture to provide man with a share in this realm becomes aware in the end of having very inadequately satisfied his insatiable thirst. Yet there remains to him the merit of having known how to divert to his advantage part of the stream of the original fullness of truth, goodness, and beauty in the measure of the possible and free from contaminations." And then he goes on to ask, can the film be a suitable vehicle for this triad, truth, goodness, and beauty, in the mind of the spectator? And he answers yes. So he goes on to talk about, in a very concrete way, the ways that this might be done in plots, in genres, and he says something interesting, and I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, which is that not every plot is possible to portray in film. Sometimes you'll hear people justifying some content in the film by it was necessary for the plot, and that may or may not be the case, right, on the level of the individual film. But I've often thought that, well, it may be the case that certain subject matters, certain specific subjects are actually just not able to be depicted in art or in a particular art form according to, the tools that it has to work with. And so, in a way that I think that's a necessary recognition, and I think it's one that should make artists humble in the sense that, we are not capable of giving a full comprehensive view of reality. And that we sometimes we have to bow either before the transcendent and what, exceeds our limit, or in prudence and morality before things that simply should not be discussed or should not be evoked, or at the very least should not be portrayed visually. And that's sort of what Pius says here. He says, quote, "Not rarely, obstacles are of an entirely practical nature interfere, which check the filmmaker on the threshold of the ideal, as, for example, the intrinsic impossibility of giving a visible representation to some truths, goodness, or beauty. The film cannot presume, nor should it run the risk of challenging plots which escape the control of the objective, which cannot be reduced to images being rebels, as it were, to scenic representation, for reasons either technical or artistic, or because of other considerations, such as reasons of social or natural delicacy, of respect or of piety, or even of prudence and the safeguarding of human life. Yet, in spite of these limitations, some intrinsic, others practical, the range of plots remains wide, rich, rewarding, and attractive, no matter what may be the element of the triad which predominates in the individual film." And so I think that's interesting. I mean, both for the reasons that I just mentioned, that I mean, we should not be too greedy. We should appreciate that the artists do not have infinite capability and infinite rights to portray whatever they want. And there's plenty for us to work with. God has given us. It's like we've been given everything, every fruit to eat except for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Like we can eat every fruit of the garden except that one. We have plenty of room to be creative. And but the other thing he says is no matter what element of the triad predominates in the individual film. So I thought that was interesting too, just because the idea that it could be truth or it could be goodness or it could be beauty. And again, I think that leaves room for a range of types of film. It leaves room for the didactic. It leaves room for the sort of narrative, and it leaves room for the aesthetic, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much there. I think we were speaking earlier about, film. I was talking earlier about like film's material is everything that can be photographed, everything that is in nature. And I think often because we are recognized like that's like anything could in a way become a film. We don't, or many filmmakers have kind of assumed that then, yeah, like as you pointed out, that everything should become a film. And of course, as we know, just from what the church has taught regarding, depictions of sexuality, the marital act, as one example, probably the one that is most foremost in people's minds about kind of like what isn't appropriate. That's something that I think a lot more work could be done by Catholic film theorists around, why is that? Not only from the, obviously we have a strong demonstration from the moral point of view and the magisterium of John Paul II, going into the nature of the marital relationship, but how that relates to film, like how does that relate to photographing nature, and what do we think that, I think a lot of people would defend, depicting the marital act, because it's real, because it's like it's part of reality, and it's like, oh, this is part of our right of what we get to show, and it's like, well, what do you really, if you're trying to photograph something in order to capture or to mediate the essence in some way of that thing, are you able to actually, have you checked to make sure that that's actually what you're doing, and this would obviously get into a lot more, this could be its own conversation, but I'm just using it as an example where the thing that's fundamentally being mediated between husband and wife, is that something that can even actually be mediated
right
to a film viewer? I would say
right.
Absolutely not. Like even just on the photographic, the ontological level of kind of what is a moving picture,
right?
It's defunct in that sense. And so I think there's a ontological case there to be made for why that should not be done,
Yes.
And there's certainly other examples, that aren't to do with that we could go into as well.